Welcome to the Dynamics Mechanics Podcast. I'm your host, Steve Smith, the Dynamics Mechanic.
This episode is brought to you by KingswaySoft. KingswaySoft is a leading integration solution provider, offering software solutions that make data integrations affordable and painlessly easy. Thousands of enterprise clients from over 80 countries and regions rely on KingswaySoft to integrate data with various business systems in order to drive their business efficiency and fully leverage their information assets. And KingswaySoft now fully works with CDS and Power Apps.
This is episode 4, the System Partitioning Strategy. Today I want to talk to you about performance in the aspect of things that you can control and things that you can't. I did a presentation today for a customer on performance, and the feedback was quite interesting. And I started off this presentation on basically how we were going to manage the performance aspects of this enterprise class system that we're building. And I started off by describing what I call the elements of performance. And they're very basic elements. I think we all know them. It's basically the client, the network, the server, and the database. If any one of these components has an issue, then to the user, the system has an issue. They don't care what is actually causing the problem. To them, they see the interface, they see that it's not working or not doing what they want it to do, and therefore your system is horrible and it needs to be fixed. And that's when people get called and you have those skip manager meetings and everybody's meeting up in the war room to discuss how they're going to fix these things. So as part of that discussion, the network is obviously a very important part of that equation, because if the client can't talk to the server, there is no system. And the discussion that I had today was more about things that we can have to deal with when it comes to the network, and things that basically what we can control and what we can't. So I discussed, as far as the network, you have basically three really elements of the network, right? You've got bandwidth. That's how much data, how much pipe you have that you can push data through, which in most cases with most companies, they're not cheap. They're not getting a dial-up connection. They're going to have a pretty good bandwidth. The second thing is latency. So just because you have a big pipe out to the internet doesn't mean that you can hop across the internet to your destination and back in a fast amount of time. So for example, if you're on a local network, then your latency tends to be, sub 5 milliseconds. As you get further away, your latency tends to increase as there's more hops that your internet traffic has to take to reach its destination and come back. So for example, if you're in the US, or let's say your CRM server is in the US, and then your customers or your users are elsewhere, let's say outside of the US, say Europe or Asia or Australia, then it can become problematic if the network latencies are exceeding a certain amount. Like when you're talking about network latency from, say, China or somewhere in Asia, for whatever reason, Asia tends to be a significantly higher latency. And we'll just leave that as it is. Well, we won't say why we think that is, but I kind of have some idea why that might be. But anyway, let's just say that, for example, that the infrastructure just isn't as great and the latencies are high, right? So you're talking like 150 milliseconds up or something like that. And even with big pipes, lots of bandwidth, your latency is going to have an impact on the user experience. So for example, if you've ever used like satellite internet, which I personally haven't, but if you have, you may notice that you can get pretty decent bandwidth, but it's just the fact of physics that it takes a second or two for, well, not literal seconds, but it takes a while for the traffic to go up to a satellite and then come back down to the earth, right? And then round trip, you got to do that again. So the network type, in addition to the latency, kind of has an impact. So for example, mobile networks tend to have a higher latency than wired networks. Same thing with the satellite, right? The satellite's a wireless network. It has that higher latency. So the challenge is, and this is basically what it boils down to, is when you're designing a system, you have to look at the user geography, or is it a multi-geo deployment scenario? And when I say multi-geo, I mean basically you have a deployment scenario where users are, let's say, across the planet. And it's funny how this happened, but I was thinking about this a couple of months back, and it's like now every customer I'm dealing with has this multi-geo scenario thing going on where they have a server somewhere, let's say, in the US, but their users are across the planet and they only have one system, and they're wondering why they have a performance issue going on. And, I what I always say is it doesn't matter if you have the beefiest servers, if you could have the fastest computer in the world running your system, right? Or computers. And the fact that latency challenge is there from someone trying to connect to your server all the way on the other side of the planet, you can't do anything about it. The fact is, those users that are having to deal with the high latency are at the mercy of whatever internet traffic happens to be going on over the internet at the time. And is that something that you really want to deal with? Now, in the past, I've recommended a partitioned system as a strategy to mitigate the latency challenge, or as we sometimes will call it, we'll shard the system, where we'll actually take a literal copy of it and move it over to a deployment that's closer to those groups of users. So with Dynamics Online now, you can, well, it's been around for a while, but you can create separate deployments of your system and place them in different regions. So let's say you have users in Europe, you have users in North America, you have users in South America, you have users in Australia. You can shard or partition your system such that you can run a copy of that system closer to those users, and therefore they don't have to experience that high latency hop thing going on, which is going to impact their user experience. Now, it just so happened that the customer I talked to today, after I talked about this, someone spoke up in the meeting and said, "Do you have a time machine?" And I said, "Well, no, I'm working on it, but no, I don't have one." He said, "I wish you said that to us 8 months ago." Because in this particular scenario, they went ahead and deployed their system from a US-based CRM deployment. But while they do have users in the US, they also have users in Europe. And apparently they felt the effects of that high latency hop. So in this multi-geo scenario thing, we do have to consider a partitioned or strategy for the system. And, I've noticed that a lot of, developers and architects, they've never done that before. And that's a new concept in the respect that they maybe have heard of it, but they've never actually tried to do it before. And the way I look at it is you just have to bake it into your design. Even if you're dealing with a customer where maybe that should be the case, that they should partition the system, sometimes a customer will say, "Well, I just don't have that in my budget. I don't want to run 2 different instances of this system." and you say, okay, fine, we'll architect the system as a single deployment for now, but we'll architect it in a way to where we can partition it fairly easily after the fact. When you find out that this latency thing actually is real and your users are complaining about the performance, we'll go ahead and partition the system such that we can still move a copy over to another locale and make sure those users aren't feeling the effects of that latency hop. Now, the next question you may have, if you're thinking about this, is, okay, wait a minute. So now I have a copy of the system over here, and then I have another copy over here. Oh, what are we going to do about that? I mean, the data is going to be different, right? Yes, you're right. It will be. And the really part of how you partition the system and what you have to do depends on the business scenario and the requirements. So, for example, in a sales scenario, which happens to be the scenarios I'm dealing with now, what you tend to have is that salespeople will focus on markets. And typically, I don't know, maybe we can't say typically, but in most cases, there isn't a lot of cross-regional selling where, for example, if someone is buying something in, say, the UK, and there's a sales deal going on there, you don't always or typically see where you have salespeople in, say, Australia assisting with the deal in the UK. And if that's the case, that actually is good because it makes life a little bit easier. Because if you're dealing with a high collaboration scenario where, let's say you've got the same piece of data and people in different regions are collaborating on it, then there's a couple ways you can kind of try to mitigate that. The challenge is if you have this highly collaborative cross-regional selling situation, then you have to kind of figure out what's the best way for those people to collaborate on that data. And my thought process as it stands today is that what you would do is once the system detects that this cross-selling scenario is in place, it can actually replicate the data over to the relevant regional copy. Let's say, for example, in Australia, such that that person that's collaborating can see the data that's changing in the other system and vice versa. Now, obviously, when you have two copies of data and you don't have a relational database to do row locking, you can have two people update the same exact record at the same time with different information. Now, how you resolve the conflict, it's really more of a business decision because there's different ways you can do it. You could do, first one wins. You could do last one wins. You could do some kind of, I don't know. There's lots of ways you can do it. But I think what you have to do is go back to the business and you have to say, okay, here are the scenarios that could happen in this particular case. What do you think is the right decision as far as handling conflicts? Now, if you get past that, maybe the next question is, well, how do we even do this, right? And I feel like this is really where Azure Service Bus shines, right? Because what you can do is for each of your partitioned copies of Dynamics, you will set up an Azure Service Bus queue or queues in the same data center as your Dynamics instance. And by doing that, what you can do is basically network each of the partitioned copies together using messaging, durable messaging, and you can transfer the information that's happening from the different partitions around as needed. Now, if you're not in that cross-selling scenario where you have to collaborate across regions, then what I would suggest in that scenario is that you don't synchronize the copies. Because, what's the point of filling, all your databases with every other region's sales history or sales activity if they don't need it, right? Like if there's 50 million records in the US database and there's 50 million in the European database, what is the point of synchronizing those so you have like 100 million in both databases and now you're paying for all that storage? That doesn't make sense. So what makes more sense is you keep the data that's relevant to that region in its own database, and then you can merge that information into a reporting database, right? And then you can generate reports. Now, each system in its own region will have operational reporting that you can do, but obviously at some point you're going to want to take the information globally and put it together and report on that. And that's really where the reporting database, where you synchronize all that in, maybe it's an Azure SQL database or whatever, and you hook up Power BI to it and you're chugging away at it. That's another case where Azure Service Bus really can come in handy and synchronize that data. Now, you may not do that. Maybe you do like a SSIS package, and maybe that actually makes more sense for the reporting standpoint, because as long as you don't need like real-time or near real-time reporting, because it kind of makes more sense to do it in batch as opposed to a messaging near real-time scenario when it comes to that, because if you're, have a bunch of activity for the day, you don't necessarily want to stream it or record at a time into your reporting database unless you have this like near real-time reporting need. So I would probably go with the SSIS in that, or actually, no, let me take a step back. Azure Data Factory, right? So Azure Data Factory V2 has been released, and it does have a Dynamics connector, which is the cloud version, or it's going to be, or meant to be, the cloud version of SSIS. As of Azure Data Factory V2, you can lift and shift your on-prem SSIS packages up to Data Factory and run them up there in the cloud. And I think that can make a lot of sense, especially if you're having to do these kind of batch cloud batch integration scenarios. I'm going to admit, I am not an expert on Azure Data Factory. I've just recently kind of become more aware of it. So I'm looking deeper into what all it can do, especially compared to on-prem SSIS packages. So I would say that that's something to definitely keep an eye on, because it's going to obviously become a very big thing, especially since you can also implement some kind of on-prem data ETL scenarios with it. I believe there's a connector that you can install on-prem that will allow it to communicate with on-prem assets, which I think is a beautiful thing. It's always been a little bit of a pain to, have these SSIS packages running on-prem, having to crawl all the way up to the cloud to do things. And it's definitely going to be nice to be able to run an SSIS type style workload up in the cloud, especially if I have other data assets up there with next to my Dynamics database. So anyway, the bottom line is, when you're dealing with a global deployment scenario and you have users that are all across the planet, you have to think kind of a little bit outside the usual box, where you are thinking of this single system deployment scenario, and you need to accommodate and this global scenario isn't really something that we've seen a lot of in the past, because it wasn't really, it was possible, but it just wasn't really something that you saw, in practice. It's like, I think companies mainly just kind of dealt with the fact that, maybe they had to run another completely different system somewhere else that was local to that particular user group. But now with, Azure and Microsoft just taking over the globe and being able to run like Cosmos DB and as a tier 0 service in every Azure data center, or tier 1, whatever, it just makes these global scenarios possible. But we just have to take into account that we have to change our architecture a little bit, well, maybe more than a little bit, to accommodate these global scenarios. And I think it's a beautiful thing. But as an architect, the architect in me, whenever I see these, global deployment scenarios, the first thing I think about is sharding the system. Now, I can't particularly take credit for this concept. It's not like I came up with this. Actually, Roger Gilchrist wrote a white paper on this a long time ago. But he wrote that before we could do separate regions for Serum Online deployment. So I think he was writing it more in a hypothetical mindset that was still possible even with like an on-prem system. But it just, at the time, it wasn't really as practical as it is today, especially when you have, Azure AD and single sign-on and all that stuff and global Azure directory. It's possible now. Really, it's really possible now. We just have to kind of up our game and think about how we architect our systems in a little different way. And so the next time you're on a project and the customer says, yeah, we've got users all across the planet, think about the partition strategy of your system, and also, of course, the complexity that comes with that, which is, do you have to synchronize the copies? And if so, how are you going to resolve conflicts and your reporting aspects of that system? And once you figure that stuff out, I think you'll be good. And even if the customer says, you're crazy, I'm not going to pay for multiple instances, you just say, okay, that's fine. We'll put it all in one, and we'll just architect the system such that when you find out the hard way that it's not going to be great when it comes to performance, then we'll go ahead and partition the system and do what I already recommended to you before you found out the hard way. So anyway, that is the gist of a multi-geo deployment scenario. Things to think about. Not that this is 100% coverage of all aspects of things that you need to consider, but it at least will get you going in the right direction. Hope you've enjoyed this episode of the Dynamics Mechanics Podcast. Feel free to reach out and connect with me on social media. You can find me on Twitter at Stephan Smith CRM, and that's STEPHAN. You can also find me on LinkedIn at Stephan Smith CRM as well. And feel free to check out my website, and that's dynamicsmechanics.com. Thank you.